Have you ever considered that the very shield you carry to protect your life might one day turn its sharpened edge toward your own heart? As I sit here in the quiet dimness of my study, the golden light of a Georgia sunset filtering through the blinds, I find myself looking at a photograph of my father. He was a man of iron will, a man who believed that a plate full of greens was a contract for immortality. But in my 30 years of practicing medicine, after walking alongside more than 30,000 souls through the harrowing corridors of illness and recovery, I have come to realize that nature operates on a clock we often refuse to hear. We spend our youth treating our bodies like indestructible machines, but then we cross a sacred, invisible threshold, 60. It is a number that carries the weight of wisdom, yet it marks a profound chemical metamorphosis. I remember a cold Tuesday morning in the clinic when the reality of this transition hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I was reviewing the charts of patients who had done everything right, men and women who avoided the siren call of fast food, who shunned the grease of bacon, and who looked at dessert as a distant memory. Yet there they were, lying in hospital beds, their lives forever altered by a stroke that arrived like a thief in the night. The shock that radiates through a family when I tell them a vegetable caused their loved one's crisis is a silence I can still hear in my dreams. Most doctors will never tell you this because it feels like a betrayal of the most basic nutritional dogma we were taught in medical school. But the clinical data from Harvard and the longitudinal studies from the world's most prestigious institutes in Japan and South Korea tell a different story, one of biological nuance and aging vulnerability. When you pass that 60-year mark, your internal landscape undergoes a tectonic shift. Your circulation, once a rushing mountain stream, begins to slow into a winding, cautious river. Your blood vessels, which used to be as flexible as a young willow branch, begin to stiffen into the texture of old, weathered parchment. Your kidneys, those magnificent silent guardians of your chemistry, become whisper quiet and hauntingly sensitive to the minerals we once ignored. It is a fragile equilibrium where a single milligram of potassium or a sudden spike in nitrates can tip the scales toward disaster. I think of the thousands of seniors I have treated who woke up with a strange, haunting tingling in their fingertips or a heavy, leaden dizziness that they dismissed as just getting older. They convinced themselves it was the weather or a poor night's sleep, never suspecting that the culprit was sitting innocently on their dinner plate just hours before. Sometimes it isn't aging that causes the catastrophe. Sometimes it is the very dinner you praised as a superfood. New research indicates that certain vegetables can quietly spike your blood pressure to atmospheric levels or thin your blood so aggressively that your brain's delicate capillaries cannot withstand the pressure while you dream. We are seeing a nearly 45% increase in dietary-related vascular incidents in patients over 65 who follow extreme health trends without clinical supervision. This is the great irony of modern longevity. The foods that saved you at 30 can betray you at 70. I want you to imagine your body as a fine, vintage timepiece. At 30, the gears are new, the oil is fresh, and it can handle a bit of dust or a sudden jolt. But after 60, those gears require a different kind of care. You cannot pour the same heavy oil into a delicate aging mechanism and expect it to keep perfect time. Your body no longer processes a plate of spinach or a glass of beet juice with the reckless efficiency of a teenager. In my 3 decades of clinical observation, I have seen how the aging gut and the stiffening artery create a perfect storm for stroke risk. We are going to deconstruct the 10 vegetables that I have seen secretly trigger these crises overnight. We will explore why the deep greens can turn your blood into a dangerous slurry, how the nightshade family can tighten your vessels like a noose, and which heart-healthy staples are actually engaging in a silent war with your daily medications. This journey we are embarking on together is about more than just a list of good and bad foods. It is a cinematic retelling of the struggle for health, a map to navigate the treacherous waters of the golden years with grace and safety. I have seen the tears of a husband whose wife followed a green cleanse right into a neuro-intensive care unit. I have felt the grip of a grandfather's hand as he asked me why his healthy diet left him paralyzed on one side. Those moments of profound pain have fueled my research and my soul. I am here to tell you that there is hope, but that hope is rooted in a deep scientific understanding of your changing biology. You don't have to live in fear of your kitchen, but you must respect the power of what you put into your body. Eating healthy after 60 is an act of translation. It is translating the needs of a changing heart into a plate of food that heals rather than harms. It is about choosing the right fuel for the specific engine you are driving today, not the one you drove 20 years ago. As we walk through these stories and these clinical breakthroughs, I want you to feel seen and understood. You are not just a patient. You are a survivor of a long and beautiful journey. And your body deserves a strategy that honors that history. We will find the natural, simple, and affordable solutions that sit right in your pantry, the things that will protect your arteries, soothe your circulation, and allow you to sleep through the night without the shadow of a stroke looming over your bed. The light is fading outside my window, but for you, a new kind of clarity is about to begin. Let us turn the page together and look at the first hidden danger waiting in the garden. Arthur Miller walked into my clinic in New Orleans with a stride that still carried the rhythmic bounce of a man who had spent 40 years playing the saxophone in smoke-filled jazz clubs. Even at 78, he had this soulful, stubborn glint in his eyes, the kind that belongs to someone who refused to let time silence his music. But as he sat across from me, I noticed his hands, those hands that once danced over brass keys, were trembling ever so slightly. He had come for a routine follow-up on his blood-thinning medication, Warfarin, a drug that acted as his lifeline against the shadows of a stroke. He leaned forward, smelling faintly of old sheet music and peppermint, and proudly told me that he had turned a new leaf. He was eating a giant bowl of fresh spinach every single day, smoothies for breakfast, salads for lunch, sautéed greens for dinner. He thought he was building a fortress around his heart, keeping it young and resilient. "I'm playing for a wedding next month, Sanjay," he said with a grin. "I need my strength. I'm doing everything right, aren't I?" I looked down at his lab results and my heart sank into my chest like a lead weight. His INR levels, the crucial measurement of how fast his blood clots, were a chaotic mess. Instead of being in the safe zone between 2 and 3, his blood had become dangerously thick, as if the life-giving river in his veins had turned into heavy molasses. The culprit was hidden right there in his vibrant green diet. Spinach is a botanical marvel, packed with iron and antioxidants, but for a senior heart on medication, it is also a concentrated source of vitamin K. This nutrient is the body's natural commander of clotting, and when you flood your system with it, you are essentially handing an override switch to your blood. It was a chemical war. The vitamin K from his healthy salads was neutralizing his medication, leaving his brain vulnerable to a wandering clot that could end his music forever in one silent second. According to clinical data from Harvard Medical School, up to 35% of seniors on anticoagulants experience dangerous fluctuations precisely because of inconsistent intake of leafy greens. I had to explain to Arthur that for his 78-year-old body, the superfood label was a double-edged sword. It wasn't just about the clotting, it was about the oxalates, natural compounds in spinach that love to bind with calcium. In a younger man, the kidneys handle this with ease, but in Arthur's case, those oxalates were beginning to form microscopic crystals, threatening his renal function and subtly pushing his blood pressure into the danger zone. I saw the light dim in his eyes for a moment, a flash of heartbreak as he realized his efforts to survive were actually putting him at risk of a massive stroke. "You mean my dinner is trying to stop my heart?" he asked, his voice cracking. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, the kind that makes me realize why I spent 10 years in surgical training, to protect souls like his from the unintended consequences of their own virtues. I didn't tell him to abandon the greens he loved because medicine is not about deprivation, it is about the wisdom of balance. I taught him the rule of consistency, a clinical strategy where we keep the vitamin K levels steady rather than letting them spike and crash like a New Orleans thunderstorm. We talked about rotating his greens, introducing romaine lettuce or arugula, leafy friends that offered the fiber he needed without the vitamin K overload. I remember the relief on his face when I told him he didn't have to give up his strength, just his excess. 2 months later, Arthur returned, and his blood work was as smooth and predictable as a classic blues progression. His INR was a perfect 2.5, his energy was restored, and most importantly, his hands were steady. He played at that wedding, and he sent me a recording of his solo. Every time I hear those deep, resonant notes, I am reminded that after 60, the secret to a long life isn't found in the extremes, but in the harmony of a well-calibrated life. Martha Higgins had the grace of a woman who had spent 82 years surrounded by the quiet dignity of a library. She lived in a small, salt-aired house in Portland, Maine, and she spoke with a softness that made you want to lean in just to hear her spirit. But when she came to see me, there was a faint purple bruise on her forehead and a shadow of deep confusion in her eyes. "Doctor, I woke up on the cold floor of the bathroom at 3 in the morning," she whispered, her hands clutching a small lace handkerchief. She had been terrified, thinking her mind was finally beginning to slip away from her. In her quest to stay healthy and stay out of the way of her busy children, she had started drinking a glass of concentrated beet juice every evening before bed. She had read in a health newsletter that beets were a miracle for circulation, a way to keep her arteries open and her blood pressure low. And on paper, she was right. Beets are rich in natural nitrates that the body converts into nitric oxide to relax blood vessels.
However, the biology of an 82-year-old woman is not a textbook equation. In the aging body, the flexibility of the arteries is compromised, and the kidney's ability to regulate fluid balance is no longer what it was at 40. When Martha drank that concentrated juice at night, her nitrate levels spiked just as her body was entering its natural state of rest. This created a phenomenon we call nocturnal hypotension, a sudden precipitous drop in blood pressure during the deepest hours of sleep. While she dreamed, her blood pressure fell so low that the oxygen-rich blood struggled to climb the hill to her brain. When she stood up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, her brain went dark for a split second and she collapsed. This is a terrifyingly common cause of silent strokes in the elderly, where the lack of pressure leads to small areas of brain tissue dying in the dark. Clinical studies from major research centers in Tokyo have shown that nearly 28% of unexplained nighttime falls in seniors are linked to such dietary-induced pressure crashes.
I sat with Martha and held her hand, explaining that her miracle juice was acting like an overdose of blood pressure medication because of the timing. The beets weren't her enemy, but her clock was. We talked about how after 60, our bodies need a predictable rhythm. The oxalates in the beets were also a concern, as they can cause inflammation in the tiny vessels of the kidneys, making it even harder for the body to maintain a steady pressure. I saw tears of relief in Martha's eyes when I told her she wasn't losing her mind. She was just over-medicating her heart with a vegetable. We adjusted her routine immediately, moving her beet consumption to 11 in the morning and cutting the portion in half. I also suggested she pair them with a few almonds or a small cup of yogurt, as the calcium in those foods binds with the oxalates in the gut, preventing them from entering the bloodstream and stressing her kidneys.
The change was almost miraculous. Martha returned to my office a month later, her step light and the bruise long gone. She told me she hadn't felt that clear-headed in years. "I feel like I've been given my life back, Dr. Gupta," she said, her voice steady and full of hope. She no longer feared the night, and she no longer felt like a burden to her family. By simply understanding the paradox of the beet, that what heals in the morning can harm in the dark, we saved her from a devastating stroke. It reminded me once again that, as a doctor, my job is to be a translator between the wisdom of nature and the reality of the aging frame. Martha is still in her library house, reading her books, with a heart that knows exactly when to rest and when to rise.
Savannah, Georgia is a place where traditions run deep. And for 75-year-old Evelyn Ross, her morning tradition was a tall glass of bright green celery juice. Evelyn was a retired schoolteacher, a woman who had spent her life pouring her energy into others, and now, in the quiet of her widowhood, she was pouring that energy into a miracle cleanse she saw on the internet. She came to me because her heart had begun to act like a frantic, trapped bird, fluttering irregularly against her ribs. She was terrified of the word arrhythmia, and rightly so, for an irregular heart is a primary breeding ground for the clots that cause strokes. As I listened to her chest with my stethoscope, I could hear the skipped beats, the chaotic rhythm of a heart that had lost its conductor. "Sanjay, I feel so weak, like my soul is thinning out with every glass I drink," she confessed, her eyes filled with a loneliness that no medicine could cure.
What Evelyn didn't realize was that celery is nature's powerful diuretic. It is designed to flush sodium and water from the system, which sounds like a blessing for someone with high blood pressure. But Evelyn was already taking a prescribed diuretic, a common medication for women her age. By adding the concentrated celery juice, she was essentially doubling her dose of water pills. Her body was losing potassium and sodium at a rate her 75-year-old kidneys couldn't manage. This led to a state of severe hypokalemia, low potassium, which is the equivalent of draining the battery that keeps the heart's electrical system firing. Without enough potassium, the heart's chambers don't contract in harmony. They quiver.
That quivering, known as atrial fibrillation, allows blood to pool and clot, which can then travel straight to the brain.
According to clinical research, electrolyte imbalances are responsible for a significant percentage of preventable strokes in the elderly population. Evelyn was shocked when I explained that her cleansing juice was actually dehydrating her brain and starving her heart of the minerals it needed to survive. She thought she was being virtuous, but she was accidentally pushing her body toward a cliff. I saw her inner turmoil, the desire to be healthy battling with the fear that she had been doing something wrong. I moved closer and told her that we were going to fix this together right in her own kitchen. We didn't need a new prescription. We needed to stop the cleanse and start the rebuild. I showed her how to use celery as a garnish or a light snack for the fiber and the crunch rather than a concentrated liquid. We focused on real hydration, pure water, and homemade vegetable broths that contained the salts her body was screaming for. Within 2 weeks of stopping the daily juice marathon, Evelyn's heart found its steady, old-fashioned rhythm again. The trapped bird had calmed down. She returned to her garden, no longer feeling dizzy or weak when she bent over her roses. She told me she felt grounded again, a beautiful word for a woman who had been accidentally floating away on a sea of celery juice. Her story is a poignant reminder that even the most innocent vegetable has a potency that must be respected, especially when the body's reserves are no longer endless. After 60, we are no longer looking for miracles or cleanses. We are looking for the steady, reliable grace of a heart that is well-fed and well-tended. Evelyn still has her celery, but now she eats it with a smile and a clear understanding that true health isn't about flushing things out, but about keeping the good things in. In the 30,000 stories I have lived through as a physician, none are as frustrating as the kale crisis. Kale has been marketed as the ultimate savior, the leafy green king that can fix everything from high cholesterol to aging skin. I've seen patients in their late 60s and 70s walk into my clinic with bags of raw kale, believing they are buying themselves an extra decade of life. But as a doctor who has spent years studying the vascular health of the elderly, I have to tell you that for a 70-year-old heart, kale is a complicated guest. The primary issue, which many of my colleagues overlook, is the staggering density of vitamin K. Just 1 cup of cooked kale provides nearly 700% of the daily recommended intake. For a younger person, the liver can process this excess. But for a senior whose metabolism has slowed by 30 or 40%, this massive influx of vitamin K can turn the blood into a hypercoagulable state, significantly raising the risk of a blood clot in the brain or heart. I remember a patient who began blending raw kale into every meal to combat his rising cholesterol. Within a month, he was in the emergency room with a TIA, a mini stroke, because his blood had become so thick that it couldn't pass through the narrowed arteries of his neck. Beyond the clotting, there is the silent issue of goitrogens. These are natural compounds found in cruciferous vegetables like kale that can interfere with the thyroid gland's ability to uptake iodine. In our 60s and 70s, the thyroid is already prone to slowing down, a condition known as hypothyroidism. A sluggish thyroid leads to a sluggish heart, lower body temperature, and poor circulation. This isn't just about feeling tired. It's about a heart that isn't pumping with the force required to keep the brain oxygenated. When circulation weakens, the risk of a stroke peaks, especially during the early morning hours when the body is at its most vulnerable.
I often have to act as a voice of caution in a world obsessed with superfood trends. I tell my patients that in the theater of health, kale is a powerful actor that needs a strict director. We shouldn't banish it, but we must understand its chemistry of aging. Clinical observations from long-term care studies suggest that seniors who consume moderate cooked portions of greens have better outcomes than those who go on kale binges. The solution I offer is rooted in traditional wisdom. Cook your kale. Steaming or sautéing kale doesn't just make it easier to chew, it significantly reduces the goitrogens and makes the vitamins more bioavailable without the massive shock to the system. I also advise my patients to keep their portions consistent. Don't eat a mountain of kale on Monday and none on Tuesday. Your blood-thinning medication needs a steady environment, not a roller coaster.
There is a profound sense of relearning that happens in my clinic. We move away from the noise of internet influencers and back to the quiet science of the individual body. I see the relief on my patients' faces when they realize they don't have to force themselves to drink bitter, raw green smoothies to be healthy. We talk about the beauty of variety, mixing kale with Swiss chard or spinach, and always in moderation. It's about building a diet that supports the heart without overwhelming it.
When we treat kale with the respect it deserves as a potent medicine, it stops being a threat and starts being a partner in longevity. After 60, the goal isn't to be a super eater, it's to be a wise eater, understanding that the greatest strength is found in the balance of all things. Frank Thompson was a man built from the grit of the Jersey City docks. At 80, he still had the broad shoulders of a longshoreman, but his knees were swollen, and he walked with a pained, rolling gait that broke my heart. He came into my office smelling of old leather and a hint of tomato sauce, complaining of a pounding in his head that wouldn't let him sleep. Frank was a proud Italian-American, and for him, tomatoes weren't just a vegetable. They were the soul of his Sunday family gatherings. He ate them in sauces, in soups, and raw with a pinch of salt, believing they were the healthiest thing on his plate because of the lycopene. My doctor told me 30 years ago that tomatoes were good for the prostate and the heart, Sanjay, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. So why do I feel like my blood vessels are on fire? I had to explain to Frank that at 80, his body's relationship with the Nightshade family had changed.
Tomatoes, along with potatoes and eggplants, contain an alkaloid called tomatine. In small amounts, it's harmless, but as we age, our systemic inflammation levels tend to rise, a process we call inflammaging. For a senior like Frank, the tomatine can act like a chemical irritant, triggering inflammation in the joints and, more dangerously, in the lining of the blood vessels. This inflammation makes the arteries stiff and less responsive to changes in blood flow. When the arteries can't expand and contract smoothly, the blood pressure spikes, creating the pounding Frank felt in his head. This stiffness is a major risk factor for hemorrhagic strokes, where a brittle vessel finally gives way under pressure. Furthermore, the high acidity of tomatoes, especially when eaten in concentrated pastes or late at night, can trigger silent acid reflux that disrupts the autonomic nervous system, causing heart rate spikes during sleep.
I sat with Frank and looked at his swollen joints, knowing that the Sunday sauce he loved was contributing to his pain and his stroke risk. It was a difficult conversation, like telling a musician he had to change his instrument. But I didn't tell him to give up his heritage. I told him to remaster it. We talked about the hidden sodium in canned tomato products, sometimes over 700 milligrams in a single serving, which was bloating his body and straining his heart. I gave him a simple, cheap solution from the kitchen. Only use fresh tomatoes and always cook them with a generous amount of high-quality extra virgin olive oil. The healthy fats in the oil help the body absorb the lycopene, the good part, while the cooking process gently reduces the acidity and the tomatine's impact. I also told him to move his tomato-heavy meals to lunch rather than a late-night dinner. The transformation in Frank was a sight to behold. A month later, he walked into the clinic without his cane, a wide grin on his face. "The pounding is gone, Doc, and I can actually move my knees again," he said, slapping his thigh. His blood pressure had dropped by 15 points, and the inflammation markers in his blood had plummeted. By understanding that his 80-year-old body couldn't handle the nightshade burden the way it once did, he had saved himself from a potential vascular catastrophe. Frank still has his Sunday dinner, but now he uses fresh Roma tomatoes and plenty of oil, and he eats earlier so his heart can rest peacefully at night. His story taught me that even our most cherished traditions can be healed when we apply a little bit of science and a lot of heart. In my 30 years of medical practice, I've seen many humble vegetables cause unexpected storms, and cabbage is one of the most frequent culprits. It's a staple for many of my senior patients because it's affordable, easy to cook, and reminds them of the simple meals of their childhood. But for those over 60, cabbage can become a silent trap for two reasons that are often missed in standard checkups. The first is the density of vitamin K, similar to kale and spinach, which can throw a wrench into the delicate balance of blood-thinning medications. But the second, and perhaps more dangerous trap, is how we choose to eat it. Many of my patients, particularly those of Eastern European or German descent, swear by sauerkraut or pickled cabbage for their gut health. While probiotics are essential, a single serving of traditional sauerkraut can contain over 1,500 milligrams of sodium, more than the total daily limit for a senior with hypertension. I remember a patient who came to me with pitting edema, swelling in the ankles that left a thumbprint when pressed. He was eating duakai moi, pickled cabbage, every evening because he thought it would help his digestion. Instead, the massive salt load was forcing his body to retain liters of extra fluid to dilute the sodium. This extra fluid volume meant his heart had to pump significantly harder, stretching his arteries to their breaking point. This fluid overload is a silent setup for a stroke, especially in the early hours of the morning when the heart rate naturally slows and the pressure can cause a vessel in the brain to leak.
Clinical research from heart failure clinics shows that dietary sodium spikes are a top reason for emergency hospitalizations in the 70-plus age group. It wasn't the cabbage that was the problem, it was the salt brine it lived in. I often have to act as a detective in these cases, tracing the unexplained rise in blood pressure back to a single jar in the refrigerator. I tell my patients that their 60-year-old kidneys are like an old filtration system. They simply cannot flush salt as quickly as they used to. When the salt stays in the blood, it acts like a magnet for water, and the pressure in the pipes goes up. I suggest a simple healing alternative. Buy fresh cabbage and steam it lightly with a splash of apple cider vinegar and a touch of caraway seeds. This gives the tang they crave without the salt-induced blood pressure spike. Cooking the cabbage also helps break down the complex sugars that cause gas and bloating, which can put physical pressure on the diaphragm and stress the heart during sleep. The relief my patients feel when they understand this is profound. They realize they aren't failing at being healthy. They were just using the wrong version of a good food. By switching to fresh steamed cabbage, they get the fiber, the vitamin C, and the cancer-fighting sulforaphane without the vascular risk. I've seen blood pressure readings drop by 20 points in a single week just by eliminating the hidden salt in pickled vegetables. It's about returning to the simplicity of the garden and moving away from the processed jars of the past. As we age, our bodies crave cleaner inputs, and a simple head of fresh cabbage is one of the greatest gifts we can give to our circulation. There is a quiet purple danger that often sits on the Mediterranean-style plates we recommend to our seniors, the eggplant. For a 70-year-old body, eggplant is not just a soft, easy-to-digest vegetable. It is a complex chemical messenger. The skin of the eggplant contains solanine, a natural defense mechanism for the plant that can act as a potent irritant to the human nervous system and circulatory walls. In my clinic, I've seen dozens of patients over 60 complain of a creeping numbness or a strange tingling in their legs after a dinner of eggplant parmigiana. They often fear they are developing neuropathy or that they've had a mini stroke already. In reality, the solanine was causing their peripheral blood vessels to constrict, reducing the flow of oxygenated blood to their nerves and brain. This vasoconstriction is a dangerous state for a senior heart, as it forces the blood pressure to climb as the heart tries to push through narrowed pipes. But there is an even stranger secret inside the eggplant. It contains trace amounts of nicotine-like alkaloids. While it's not enough to make you addicted, for a senior who is already sensitive to stimulants or has a history of hypertension, this trace amount can cause a subtle spike in heart rate and a flush of the skin. This stimulant effect can disrupt the natural circadian rhythm of the heart, leading to palpitations in the middle of the night. I've had patients wake up with their hearts racing, convinced they were having a heart attack, only to find out it was a reaction to the nightshade dinner they had consumed 3 hours prior. Furthermore, the eggplant's porous structure makes it a fat magnet. When it's fried, it can soak up more oil than a sponge, delivering a massive dose of inflammatory fats directly into the bloodstream, which clogs the arteries and sets the stage for a future stroke. I sit with these patients and we look at the ecology of their diet. I don't tell them to fear the eggplant, but to treat it with the caution you would give a powerful medicine. I teach them the salt and sweat method, slicing the eggplant and salting it for 30 minutes to draw out the bitter juices that contain the highest concentration of solanine, then rinsing it thoroughly. I also suggest they roast or grill it with a tiny bit of olive oil and a heavy dusting of turmeric. The curcumin in turmeric is a natural anti-inflammatory that helps counter any irritation the nightshade might cause. We also talk about the frequency rule. After 60, eggplant should be a guest in your kitchen, appearing perhaps once or twice a month rather than a weekly staple. Seeing the tingling disappear from a patient's life is one of the great joys of my work. They realize that they aren't falling apart. They just needed to understand the hidden chemistry of their food. When we reduce the nightshade burden, the inflammation in their arteries subsides, their blood pressure stabilizes, and their sleep becomes deep and restorative. It's a reminder that as we age, our bodies become more discerning, and we must become more discerning in return. The eggplant, with its deep purple mystery, can be enjoyed safely, but only when we have the wisdom to prepare it with respect for the fragile beauty of the aging heart. Samuel Vance, a 77-year-old retired postman from Columbus, Ohio, was a man of simple habits and a sturdy heart. But when he sat in my office, he looked weary, his eyes clouded with a fog that he couldn't shake. Sam believed he was eating a real food diet. No fast food, just a meat and potatoes dinner every night. "I grew up on these, Doc, and I'm still standing," he'd say with a proud smile. But Sam's blood pressure was a mounting storm, and his glucose levels were swinging like a pendulum. I had to explain to him that at 77, his body saw his daily baked potato not as a vegetable, but as a massive sugar bomb. A medium-sized potato has a glycemic index higher than many sodas, and for an aging metabolism, that spike in blood sugar causes a massive surge in insulin. This insulin spike doesn't just lower sugar, it inflames the delicate lining of the arteries, making them sticky and prone to the plaque buildup that causes strokes. Sam was caught in a glucose roller coaster. He would eat his potato, his sugar would skyrocket, damaging his vessels, and then it would crash, leaving him exhausted and dizzy. This dizziness is often mistaken for simple fatigue, but in a senior, it can be a sign of cerebral hypoperfusion, where the brain isn't getting enough steady fuel. But there was another hidden danger for Sam. Because he was taking an ACE inhibitor for his blood pressure, his body was already holding on to potassium. Potatoes are one of the most potassium-rich foods on Earth. By eating them daily, Sam was risking hyperkalemia, excessively high potassium, which can cause the heart to stop without warning. "You mean my safe potato is the reason I'm so dizzy?" he asked, his voice trembling with the realization that his comfort food was his biggest risk. I looked at Sam, seeing the decades of hard work in his hands, and I knew I couldn't just take away his favorite food. Instead, we worked on a plate balance strategy. I taught him to cut his potato portion in half and to never eat it naked. By adding a healthy fat like olive oil and a large serving of fiber-rich broccoli, he could slow down the sugar absorption and prevent the insulin spike. We also talked about the cold potato trick, cooking potatoes and then letting them cool in the fridge. This process turns the starch into resistant starch, which is much slower to digest and doesn't cause the same blood sugar explosion. I also encouraged him to experiment with mashed cauliflower, which gave him the comfort of the texture without the glucose burden. Within 3 weeks, the fog in Sam's mind began to clear. His blood pressure readings, which had been stubbornly high for years, finally began to settle into a safe range. He told me he had more energy in the afternoons than he did in his 50s. "I feel like a new man, Sanjay," he said, his eyes bright with a newfound hope. He still had his potato on Sundays, but he treated it like a special dessert rather than a daily necessity. Sam's journey is a powerful lesson that after 60, the comforts of our youth can become the hazards of our old age if we don't adapt. By mastering his glucose roller coaster, Sam didn't just lower his blood pressure, he built a shield around his brain, ensuring that his retirement would be spent in the light of clarity, not the shadow of a stroke. As I look back on the 30,000 faces I have treated, I find myself thinking of the bitter melon, a vegetable that is often called the plant-based insulin. In many cultures, it is revered as a healer, a sacred way to cleanse the blood and cool the body. But for a senior who is already managing their health with modern medicine, this healer can become a hidden danger. Bitter melon contains compounds that mimic insulin so perfectly that they can cause a sudden catastrophic drop in blood sugar, hypoglycemia. For a 70-year-old, a blood sugar crash isn't just a dizzy spell, it is a crisis that starves the brain of its only fuel. I've seen patients collapse in the street because their healthy bitter melon juice combined with their diabetes medication to create a perfect storm of low sugar. This state of confusion and loss of consciousness can mimic a stroke perfectly and, in extreme cases, can actually trigger one by depriving the brain's neurons of energy. I want you to take a deep breath and hear my voice as a friend who has walked this path with so many. The journey we have taken through these 10 vegetables isn't about fear. It's about biological respect. After 60, your body is a masterpiece of survival, but it is also a finely tuned instrument that requires a different kind of music. You cannot simply follow the latest superfood trend and hope for the best. You must understand that even the most natural medicine has a potency that can backfire. My advice to you today is simple and profound. Become the CEO of your own circulation. Listen to the quiet signals of your body, the tingling, the dizziness, the midnight heartbeats. These are not just signs of aging. They are your body's way of asking for a change in its chemical environment. Here is my final doctor's prescription for you. First, embrace the power of variety. Never let a single superfood dominate your plate. Rotate your greens, diversify your colors, and always choose fresh over processed. Second, prioritize steady state nutrition. Avoid the spikes and crashes of concentrated juices and large starchy meals. Third, never make a major dietary change without a conversation with your healthcare provider. Your medications and your meals are in a constant dialogue, and we must make sure they are speaking the same language. And finally, return to the simple, cheap, and natural healers in your kitchen: water, olive oil, garlic, and a peaceful mind. These are the true foundations of a heart that beats with strength and a brain that remains sharp as a diamond. The clock is ticking, but it doesn't have to be ticking against you. You have the power right now, at this very moment, to make a choice that protects your independence and your future. Don't wait for a mini stroke or a dizzy fall to tell you that something is wrong. Take action today. Look at your dinner plate through the lens of wisdom we have shared. Start by making one small change, perhaps steaming your kale instead of eating it raw, or moving your beet juice to the morning. These small, consistent steps are the stones that build the fortress of your longevity. You have worked hard for your 60, 70, or 80 years. Now let your food work just as hard for you.
If this journey has touched your heart or opened your eyes, I ask you to join our community. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Senior Health Tips. We are building a sanctuary of science-based wisdom to help you live stronger, longer, and healthier without the confusion of fad diets. Share this with someone you love, a friend, a sibling, or a neighbor who might be unknowingly putting themselves at risk. Your support allows us to keep bringing these life-saving truths to light. Together, we can turn the bitter truth into a beautiful, long-lasting vitality. Stay well, take care of your magnificent heart, and I will see you in our next session as we continue to walk the path of healing together.